There is a sentence in Matthew 6 that looks at first like ordinary spiritual advice, and at second like a sealed door into a different world. People read it, nod, and move on without realizing that the sentence is an earthquake in theological language. In the streets and market squares of first-century Palestine, where religion often performed like a play, this single instruction rewrites the script for anyone who thinks faith is about applause. Imagine the noise of a crowded street, the sharp smell of roasted lamb, the feel of dust underfoot, and the bright glare of midday sun on leather and cloth. Against that sensory backdrop, a voice speaks, not to shame public life, but to reorder it. It is a small reversal, and yet it contains a revolution. When the teacher says to pray in private, he does not ask for secrecy as an option. He proposes a reorientation of the heart. If you stay with me through this hour, you will not only see the cultural mechanics Jesus confronts, but you will receive a practical roadmap to move your own life away from performance and toward a kingdom that sees the heart. Are you willing to go behind the curtain where the real work happens? This is not abstract theology. It is pastoral truth that has reshaped communities and quiet lives for 2 millennia. Listen now to how the scene is set and why what follows changes everything. The world Matthew addresses is a world saturated with public piety. The synagogues are fuller than the threshing floors. Pharisees and scribes stand where the street widens, and their robes signaled more than warmth. In that setting, religion sometimes becomes theater. People measure spiritual success by place and visibility. Alms are not only coins in a bowl. They are coins displayed, announced, counted, recorded, and then remembered at the next gathering. Fasting is a badge put on like a clear thread, or a pale face worn for social credential. Prayer becomes a performance in which length and volume are currencies. The social economy rewards visibility. If you are seen, you gain status. If you are not seen, you are forgotten. The cultural pressure is subtle and total. In those days, honor systems surrounded everyone like a second skin. Imagine Miriam whispering to James in the market, eyes flicking to a man bowing loudly in the corner. Imagine Pastor Mark writing notes about who fasted and when. The building of reputation is slow but relentless. It is from this worn fabric that Jesus picks a single thread and pulls. He does not call for less piety. He calls for a different orientation of piety, from outward show to inward life. The problem Matthew exposes is not sincerity versus hypocrisy in a simple binary. It is a pervasive social grammar that trains people to perform faith as display. That grammar shapes how a person prays, gives, and fasts. The scene is noisy, sensory, and politically charged. The dust tastes like iron in your mouth. The sound of sandals is a metronome counting the steps toward public recognition. What is at stake is not etiquette, it is the destiny of the heart. Into that crowded scene comes the protagonist of our narrative. He stands low among the crowd, yet his words land as if from a higher place. He is both carpenter and rabbi, a man who knows the feel of saw and the weight of a word. He speaks with a voice that unpacks habit into meaning. He looks like many of them, but he sees differently. The cameras of the human gaze miss what his gaze catches. In one movement, he points to a door and invites the listener to go through. He is not an abstract teacher. He is a person who shares meals with fishermen and scholars. He notices small things. He sees the way Simon folds his hands. He sees Lydia stiffen when a coin clinks on a table. He hears Ruth swallow her pride when anyone praises her charity. The narrative perspective centers on those who follow him. It places the reader beside a figure named Simon, who is learning to read his own motives. Simon watches as Jesus speaks, and the scene becomes intimate. There are micro-gestures. A woman straightens the fringe of her prayer shawl. A child tugs at Thomas to point at the speaker. A coin glints in Andrew's palm. All of these details allow the audience to feel the shift from public spectacle to private transformation. The protagonist invites us to understand that religious life is not primarily about what others think, but about what God sees. Simon has a backstory that explains why he is attentive to this particular reversing of values. He is not a parable. He is careful and wounded. He grew up in a small house by a fishing cove where his father Thomas taught him to mend nets and to count fish. As a boy, Simon learned how the market works, how to read a buyer by the way his hand tapped the wooden counter. That early life taught him to measure worth in visible goods, and in the confidence of those who bought from him. His mother Ruth taught him to pray aloud at the table and to fold hands with neighbors when visitors came. He learned performance at home as he learned grammar. In youth, Simon followed a pattern of care that rewarded public approval. When he was 20, his sister Lydia fell ill, and the family learned a new vocabulary of helplessness. In the suddenness of loss, he watched how friends kept distance until things were visibly under control. The experience taught him that public demonstrations of faith often stand in for real presence. Later, Simon moved to the city and found work in a linen shop owned by Miriam, a woman of care and sharp perception. Miriam encouraged him to read small scrolls and to listen rather than to speak. That practice put him in the path of James, a young scribe who loved phrases and punctuation. James and Simon argued late into the night about what made life holy. Those conversations pushed Simon towards something he could not yet name. He arrived at the hillside listening for a difference between performance and devotion. In these paragraphs, Simon is not a hero yet, he is a seeker. He carries anxiety in his chest and a small stubborn hope. His backstory explains why the instruction to pray in secret lands like rain on dry ground. The central teaching of the scene arrives like a compass needle snapping into place. A line that appears mundane at first becomes the key to a new geographic map of the soul. The teacher says to give and to pray and to fast, but to do so not for human praise, but for the Father who sees in secret. He uses short declarative phrases. He contrasts the visible rewards of men with the invisible reward of God. He instructs that when you give, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. He says when you pray, do not use vain repetitions like the pagans, but enter into the inner room and close your door. He warns that anyone who seeks applause has already received their reward. That paradox pushes against the grammar of religion. The juxtaposition is stark. The teacher does not abolish social worship. He relocates the worth of worship to the place where God is the only audience. The line about the Father who sees in secret functions as a theological axiom. It implies that the primary economy of redemption is measured by attention, not by applause. The exegesis is simple and radical. The phrase "see in secret" reframes motive as the decisive element. The imagery he uses is domestic: a closed door, a candle lit in a small room, the smell of oil, the hush of breath. These images are sensory and intimate. Feel the waxy scent of the lamp. Hear the soft scrape of fabric as a person sits in the shadow. Taste the dryness of fear and hope together. The instruction is not a rule book. It is an invitation to a new grammar of life, where the heart hears before the world applauds. There is a small technical aside that clarifies how the text transmits. Scholars note that Matthew composed his gospel for a community navigating public life under scrutiny. Textual critics point to small variations among manuscripts, but the core imperative about privacy and inward devotion is stable across witnesses. Archaeology in synagogues and market remains shows how public display functioned as social capital. This procedural note helps us see that Matthew is not inventing a private ethic out of thin air. He is naming a dynamic he observes and offering an alternative practice. The detail matters. It is not abstract. It changes how one imagines the act of prayer. It relocates piety from stage to chamber. The practical implications of this instruction are immediate and concrete. If prayer is to be private, then morning routines change. If giving is to be secret, then community practices of charity must be reorganized. The audience must learn new rituals that do not rely on human reward. Imagine Simon waking up 15 minutes earlier and closing the shop door before he prays. Imagine Lydia slipping a small bag of provision into a neighbor's basket at night so that no one knows. Imagine Pastor Mark adjusting the church bulletin so that it does not list names for praise. These are practical shifts that rewire habit. They are not impossible. They demand courage. The sensory landscape of these practices is vital. The hush of a closed room, the slight scent of oil on the windowsill, the coolness of morning air on your face when you bow are the textures that reinforce the inward life. The change runs deeper than behavior. It affects anxiety. When a believer no longer counts spiritual status by public applause, they are free from a particular kind of performance anxiety. Anxiety goes because the metric shifts from external validation to divine attention. But the move is delicate. The risk is that privacy becomes secrecy and isolation. That is why community must learn to practice humility publicly without making humility another spectacle. That balance requires wisdom and gentleness. At this point, imagine a short scene of dialogue that models what it looks like to learn. The dialogue unfolds in a shop between Simon and Miriam, and it extends to show hesitation and small actions. Miriam asks Simon quietly, "What makes you so restless?" Simon pauses and runs a hand over the linen. "I keep thinking that giving must be seen for it to count." Miriam tilts her head and smiles softly. "But if you give only for applause, Simon, what do you have left when the applause fades?" Andrew overhears and says, "The coin in my hand bought me respect yesterday, but it did not buy sleep." "That is honesty," said Miriam. "Tell me then, what happens if you give when no one praises you?" Simon lowers his voice and there is a new gentleness. "If no one praises me, I might finally know why I give." Miriam places her palm lightly on the counter. "That is the heart of it," she says. "It is not the crowd that blesses you, it is the Father who sees in secret." The exchange continues with pauses, breaths, micro-movements, and intentional hesitations that reveal a change not sudden but gradual. Each line lands with sensory detail, the roughness of linen, the metallic clink of a coin, the warmth of Miriam's palm. The dialogue contains 5 exchanges to model the density required and to show the slow formation of a new habit. A practical template follows that helps the viewer turn teaching into daily pattern. Begin with a 5-minute secret ritual. Close a door, light a small candle. Candle. Place your hands on your knees and speak aloud a short prayer, starting with "Father," and a single sentence of confession, then a sentence of gratitude, and finally a request for daily bread. Keep sentences short and concrete. Use the Lord's Prayer as structure without reciting it wholesale. Phrase the opening as, "Our Father, who is in heaven, hallowed be your name," and then continue with simple items you need that day. For forgiving, create a hidden box where you place small sums unannounced. Then set a monthly plan to distribute those funds without public ceremony. For fasting, choose a private day and refrain from announcing it on social channels. For corporate practice, create opportunities for anonymous service in your local body. Each of these steps decomposes into small actions. Each action is sensory. The quiet light of a candle, the cold weight of a coin, the plane of an envelope being slid under a door. All of these material cues help the soul learn that God rewards those who seek Him not for shows, but for truth. Broader themes emerge when the teaching is placed against the metaphors of treasure and sight and heart. Treasure shifts from visible accumulations to invisible stores kept in heaven. Eyes are redirected from outward admiration to inward gaze. The metaphor of soil and seed reappears. A person who stores treasure in heaven is like one who seeds deep in soil that birds cannot reach. The language of temptation resurfaces. The temptation to be seen is subtle, like a moth that flutters toward a porch light. The remedy is not legalism, but reformation of attention. The narrative draws on historical voices to show continuity. The monks of the early church organized cellars and locked chests for the poor, so that charity could be anonymous. Later reformers argued for a priesthood that served without parading status. Each movement aimed to protect the heart from the hunger for gaze. Theologically, the passage connects to forgiveness. If the Father sees in secret, then he also forgives in secret. That double sees and forgives shapes a life oriented to trust rather than performance. The language of the kingdom is persistent. When you change the place where you store treasure, you change the direction of your hopes, and your anxieties begin to fall away. The sensory image is of hands placing a small coin into dark soil and then walking away without looking back. To make the teaching live in history, we look at testimonies and movements that embody it. Consider Thomas, a later monk who abandoned a small inheritance and took vows of secrecy in service. Consider Lydia, a widow in the 2nd century who gave quietly to hungry neighbors and was later remembered only in a single letter. Consider Pastor Mark in the modern era, who removed name tags from his charity list so that givers could remain unknown. Consider Miriam, who started a simple kitchen where volunteers cooked for anonymous guests. Consider James, the scribe who in his old age refused public accolades and wrote short notes to encourage secret acts of kindness. These named figures are illustrative and real in spirit, if not always identical to an ancient record. Their actions demonstrate the long arc of a practice that resists spectacle. Each name carries a specific action. Miriam started a kitchen. Lydia wrote a short treatise. James handed down a manuscript. Thomas lived alone in a cell. Andrew organized anonymous collection. Ruth taught prayer by example. Elena, a visiting scholar, translated a text that preserved small teachings. These stories aim to show how the teaching reshapes both individual character and communal structures. At roughly 1/3 into this narrative, pause for a moment with me. If what you hear now unsettles you, know that you are in good company. Many who first encounter the idea of private devotion feel a strange relief and a strange fear. If this idea touches something inside you, please write below a short answer to this question. In your daily life, where do you feel most tempted to perform rather than to be real? Share a concrete situation or even a single word. If you comment here, you help a community learn that they are not alone, and you help shape future conversations that respond to your concern. Your story matters, and it will help others see that transformation is possible. Now let us return to the heart of the instruction and see how the prayer the Lord teaches helps reframe daily life. The Lord's Prayer as given in Matthew 6 functions as a template that directs attention outward to God and inward to trust. The opening phrase, "Our Father, who is in heaven, hallowed be your name," places God as both intimate and majestic. That paradox is the starting point of prayer. To call God Father locates deep relationship. To call his name hallowed locates awe. The prayer then moves through daily dependency toward forgiveness and protection from temptation. Each petition is short and a prank to community. The practice of using the prayer as daily structure trains the believer to align needs with God's economy, not the world's. It is practical theology lived in the rhythm of breath. The sensory details persist. The whisper of words in a small room, the slight bowing of the head, the coolness of dawn, all anchor the prayer so that the body learns what the heart must remember. Tension arises in the interior life as old habits resist the new orientation. Simon experiences several pressure points that test his resolve. The first moment comes when a neighbor publicly praises a gift Simon made, and he feels an old surge of pride. He stands at a crossroads. He can bask, or he can redirect the praise to the Father in secret. He remembers the teacher's words and chooses the latter. The internal conflict is heavy with memory and pride. It plays out in 2 short paragraphs of internal presser details. The second moment happens when someone in the community accuses Simon of withholding charity. The public question pierces him, and he must decide whether to reveal his anonymous acts to clear his name. He chooses silence and trusts that the Father sees. That choice costs him reputation but preserves integrity. The third tension surfaces when Simon faces temptation to stage his piety for a new audience after earning a small measure of respect. He hears again the voice that says, "Why hide now?" He resists, and the struggle is visceral. Each moment lasts several paragraphs and contains memory intensity and an eventual decision to trust the hidden reward. These scenes are about 500 to 600 characters each and show the slow formation of a heart that prefers God's reward to human applause. As the narrative moves toward climax, the community begins to change in small, visible ways. Pastor Mark removes the weekly recognition board. Miriam instructs her kitchen volunteers to refuse photograph requests. Andrew organizes a fund distribution with no list and no names. The public response is mixed. Some accuse them of secrecy and disorganization. Others experience relief. The shift is not dramatic overnight, but it is steady. The community discovers that when acts are anonymous, they are more generous. The wounds of performance begin to heal. Simon sleeps more easily. Lydia finds her own prayer life deepening. James writes a short note to the assembly reminding them that God sees in secret and God who sees will reward. The change is slow but real. After the turning point, the epilogue charts the practical outcomes over time. 1 month later, Simon notices an unexpected calm. The immediate effect is a reduction in his anxiety about being seen. He wakes earlier and prays in a small room. He still walks through the market, but his hands do not seek applause. He feels lighter when a neighbor thanks him because he no longer measures worth by external applause. The sensory details of this first month are precise. He feels the cool morning air on his face. He tastes plain bread with fresh gratitude. He hears the faint echo of his own steps in an empty street. These small changes are the early fruits of a relocated heart. At 3 months, the pattern deepens. Community patterns shift. Pastor Mark's removed recognition board is now replaced by a quiet practice of shared anonymous service. Miriam's kitchen serves more guests because volunteers feel freed from self-promotion. Lydia reports a growing peace in her own prayers. The emphasis on secret acts creates a new trust among neighbors because deeds no longer seek return. The material signs begin to accumulate. The congregation reports fewer conflicts over status. There is still resistance, but the culture of secrecy has created a new baseline of humility. At 6 months, the effects have institutionalized in small ways and spiritual fruit appears. Simon has become a model. He helps to lead an initiative that distributes food without names, and the project inspires a sister community to adopt a similar practice. Anxiety about spiritual standing has decreased measurably for several people, and the community reports a deeper sense of shared purpose. These long-term changes show that the teaching is not an isolated ethic, but a formative practice that shapes both individual character and communal structures. Before we close, let us consider briefly what this means for you tomorrow. Practical application is simple but disciplined. Wake 15 minutes earlier. Close the door. Light a small lamp. Speak a short prayer starting with Father and 1 sentence of confession and gratitude. Practice 1 anonymous act of giving this week. Refrain from announcing it. Track internally, not externally. These are small acts, but they reorient the heart. If you begin, you will find that anxiety about status diminishes and trust in the Father increases. The final invitation is to place your treasure where your heart will follow. Subscribe to this channel if you want more deep dives like this, and share this message with someone who needs the courage to pray where no one can see. The story of the one who treasures God over applause is not private in its effect. It changes neighborhoods, houses, and congregations. Religion performed for applause is exposed by a single sentence in Matthew 6. What remains after the exposure is not shame, but the opportunity to cultivate an inward life that trusts the Father who sees in secret. Tomorrow, take a practical step, close a door, and say a simple prayer. 1 month from now, notice the change. 3 months from now, measure the pattern. And 6 months from now, you may find a different rhythm of life. The small acts of secret devotion will accumulate into a life that stores treasure where moths cannot reach. The final word is short and urgent. Keep your heart where it matters, and you will find that what God sees in secret becomes the truest measure of your life.